My name is Shaun Abrahamson from Motopo, and we are the co-organizers of today's festivities. Hopefully, it will be somewhat enjoyable. I know it's going to be a lot of new information, a lot of interesting discussion. And so we will, of course, finish the day with some drinks. Okay, so on to a couple of thoughts about why we are doing this in the first place. And so this is from a 1930s general fireproofing furniture catalog. And so this was sort of state-of-the-art modern office. But what's interesting about this is that we would all recognize this as a place that people work. A telephone may be sort of retro, modern, something. It only has one app, so maybe you would complain. It sort of just does voice. And the suits may come back into fashion somewhere in Brooklyn and Berlin. But we would recognize it as a place of work. What's more interesting is that this is where I spend a lot of time working. And it's not because I travel a lot. This is the Ace Hotel on 29th and Broadway, and this is their lobby. And there's a lot of people sitting around chatting and looking at screens. And if you show up there most mornings or most afternoons, you'll see people doing some type of work. But probably this is the very visible part of what we can see. What we probably see less of, and I'm not suggesting that we go out and work by the pool. This is just my Facebook profile. But this is really where the interesting work is happening, right? You sort of have to sit next to someone and peer into the screen that they're looking at to understand how much work has changed, right? And so that's not really my opinion. Fortunately, there are people who are sort of far more visible who are interested in this. And so in the middle of last year, Mark Zuckerberg was interviewed about what he was thinking about in the future. And his perspective is that over the last sort of 5 years that Facebook has rapidly expanded, they've just focused on connecting people, right? So we've been somewhat connected with email, but they've changed the way that we connect. But what's really interesting is what happens now that everyone's connected, right? So what happens once we've got all these connections and we can communicate in new ways? And I think actually we already have a good sense for what might happen, right? We have the better part of almost 2 decades of some really interesting reorganization of the way that work is being done, right? So if you go all the way back to Linux, yes, it's email, so it's not as sexy, but Linux found a way to transform the way that software was developed, right? And it was rethinking what your customers do, rethinking what your users do. Pushing testing out to your users. It seems like a small switch, but it sort of revolutionized how people think about developing software, and it's kind of at the core of how a lot of software development happens now. We'll hear from Odesk later, but Odesk has been around for a decade. And then we're going to hear from Peter, so we'll talk a little bit about Mindstorms. But Mindstorms is also almost a decade old. And this was sort of one of the first examples of putting a piece of hardware and software out into the world and finding that what you originally designed it for was, in fact, less interesting than what other people could do with it. And sort of how do you manage that response? And we'll let one of our speakers address this. So this is all very interesting, and I think the reason that we organize today is really one sort of fairly simple recurring theme that we see, which is what we tend to see is the end result of work. Right? We see the Lego product on the shelves. We see the Baja race car. We see Linux software. We see all the end products. But we don't actually see how those things came into existence. We don't see what the work is that happened to bring them into the world. And so we often say to people that we think it's because all the changes are sort of hiding in plain sight. Right? So we see the examples. We don't really give a second thought to what's changed to get them. And so this is the point of today. So we love Lego, so we're going to talk about Lego. But the real point is there are a group of people in completely different fields, from research across different industries, who are working the magic, as it were, to figure out how to transform work, how to reorganize people, how to cooperate and coordinate in new ways using the new connections that Mark Zuckerberg referenced.